All right, welcome to part two of journalism. And of course, as I promised from part one, we would be focusing on newspapers in part two, which are absolutely a huge part of the journalism, not just history, but I guess the lack of newspapers or physical newspapers is, of course, certainly a big issue within the journalism field. I was going to show you an actual newspaper, but didn't grab one in time. So we'll just assume that you've seen a newspaper before. Anyway, yeah, so there's a major difference, I think, between when we talk about newspapers and what we talked about in part one, which was kind of I call it the multimedia / broadcast side of the house. And so I want to, in this lecture, basically, we're going to be talking about some of the numbers that come with the newspaper industry. Then we're going to get into the history and then kind of circle back to modern times and why, newspapers, I think, are important. Now, one thing I will say, and I would say this if we were face to face, I think there's this kind of this notion, this idea that journalism is, a dying industry. And I disagree with that. I think certainly, we talked a lot about in part one about some of the issues with how journalism has gone from, and I don't think I used this in part one, but, journalism has gone from being sort of this watchdog of government and those that do wrong to bordering on, propaganda at times. But that being said, I think the issue with newspapers is that, yes, are physical newspapers dying, and have they been dying for a while? They have. I certainly would venture to guess that if you were sitting in front of me and I asked you to raise your hand if you've actually physically picked up a newspaper, like a physical newspaper itself, many of you probably haven't. Maybe you've never done it, or if you have, it was a long time ago. But that doesn't mean that newsprint is dead. In fact, it's just shifted. So a lot of what you are consuming now has moved over, obviously, to the web. It has moved over to the digital side of the house. So anyway, that being said, let's get into newspapers and tell you and introduce you to what I think is one of the oldest forms of journalism / mass communication, and it obviously is evolving like everything else. So, newspaper headlines. This is by and large within the last, I would say, 18 months to 2 years. These are kind of the, no question, the pandemic, which began in March of 2020 and, is still felt today. That hit the newspaper industry hard. The top 25 papers in the country have lost 20% of their weekday print since March of 2020, 4.7 million early 2019 to 3.4 million in early 21. I can tell you that, part of that I think would have happened anyway, but I think just like everything else, as we have kind of, first sheltered in place in March of 2020, and then just gotten used to not having to, deal with people, or at least deal with, interpersonal things at times, that we've kind of come to rely heavily more on just on technology, and that's not a surprise. So the big three national papers, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and USA Today, lost more than 500,000 customers. That's incredible. I can tell you, the USA Today, one of the reasons it struggled is that one of the things that, if you've ever traveled, then that if you've ever spent any time at like the little, continental breakfast or whatever, there used to be, it used to be that USA Today was sitting there and it was sitting at your door. Well, of course, people didn't travel, or at least traveled less in the initial phases of the pandemic. Only now we're starting, I think, to get back to it. But in the interim, the USA Today just, basically started, I think, just essentially figured that people were going to be on their phones getting the same information. So why bother spending that kind of money? And advertisers, by the way, say, why bother advertising in the paper that no one's going to see, right? The Wall Street Journal, I would say, is probably in the best shape of all. It remains the largest newspaper, and it also, by the way, has an incredible digital footprint. at WSJ.com. Cheap plug, no, I'm kidding. But anyway, the Wall Street Journal has really become, which at one point was a financial paper, is now a general, a paper that has general news in it. And I know that it's considered an industry leader. All right. How about top newspapers, right? Average weekday print circulation of selected newspapers in the United States from October 20 to March 21 in the thousands. So Wall Street Journal has a circulation nationwide of 786,000. New York Times is at 362,000. New York Times, even though it's a New York paper, is also a national paper. The USA Today is also national at 183. This is again physical newspapers that people actually get on their driveways or wherever they read them. The rest, if you look at the rest, Washington Post, LA Times, New York Post, Tampa Bay Times, and on down, these are actually local papers. So the first three are national. Washington Post, by the way, who owns it? Jeff Bezos, right? Amazon. Okay. Now, all of these newspapers that you see are, of course, you can get, subscriptions to them digitally. But as far as physically having something show up in your driveway, it's the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, USA Today. Okay. Leading global English news websites in the United States. This is monthly visits, 2021 on average, right? CNN, or I'm sorry, not on average. I'm sorry, this was in September of 2021. This was just a snapshot of a month. CNN.com, 378 million. That's million, guys, not 100. That's not thousand. 378 million unique visitors in the millions. MSN.com, 329 million. Fox News, 266. So you can see that these numbers are just absolutely are just dwarf what an actual newspaper, a physical copy of a newspaper can do. For example, the Washington Post has 180,000, right, that physically pick up that paper on a monthly basis. In September of 21, 122 million people were looking at the Washington Post. You can see why Jeff Bezos, for example, was interested in buying that paper. If you want to look at an interesting link, there's an outfit by the name of Pew Research. They do a lot of surveys and analysis and data mining in a lot of different things that are journalism and media content related. And they periodically look at the newspaper industry. And so there's a link there if you want to take a look at Pew Research. And it talks about, it's a couple years old, but it talks about some of the dangers that the newspaper industry is in and uses data to back it up. So by all means, please take a look. All right, but let's run through some of these numbers here. By the numbers, employment in newspaper newsrooms, you can see 2004, right before we hit the recession in 2008, was kind of the high water mark for newsroom employment. Of course, this also happens to sort of parallel the fact that, the internet, even though the internet had been around for, probably 10 to 12 years by the early 2000s, the fact is that the iPhone really kind of changed the game. The iPad changed the game. And you can see that it steadily, so I would say, that was a big factor. Another factor here is obviously the economic slowdown. 2008 was a tremendously rough time. Technology took over, the digital industry took over. You could consolidate jobs, and much like we saw in the broadcast industry, where you saw numbers decrease, you see the same thing happen within the newspaper industry, and of course it's fallen off. All right, a couple other things I want to show you here. Share of newspaper advertising revenue coming from digital advertising has climbed steadily from 2011 all the way up through 2020, and will continue to climb. And that is a reflection of the fact that you, me, and everyone else who is reading any kind of newsprint is reading it in a digital format, not in a newspaper format. So therefore, if you're an advertiser, and that's what drives obviously revenue in the newspaper industry, just like any other media industry, The advertising is going towards digital, toward websites, toward apps, toward, social media. And of course, that is a reflection of why digital advertising is climbing. As for unique visitors of newspaper websites, people using the web, for example, in some shape or form, that also has climbed from around 7 million or so in 2014 to the end of the quarter, which would have been around September to December of 2020, nearly 15 million. I could not find a more recent number, but my guess is it's gone north, significantly north of 15 million. Which means that basically newspapers continue to grow on the digital side. Now it's just a matter of how do you monetize it, right? All right. As for, now here's the thing though. So this is what concerns me and I think should concern you. So you can see that more people are significantly going to the internet or social or whatever to look, or digital, right, is the broad term, to go look at news and information. But look at this. How much time are they spending? Literally less than 2 minutes going to that website, looking at news and information, 2 minutes. How much can you learn going to like the LAtimes.com or the Signal or or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, whatever it is, and only spend less than 2 minutes on that site and really feel like you're fully informed? I don't think you can. And so I think there's a reason why that, there's I would say in this country and in the world, there's a deficiency when it comes to comprehending and understanding stories, because we're like short attention span, right? And I think this really kind of like proves it. So, whereas I think in the past, just a theory, that if you picked up an LA Times, a physical paper of the LA Times, you would actually, and you'd spread it across on the table or in your lap and you'd be reading it. You probably wouldn't just be spending a minute and a half glancing at it and then putting it down. You'd probably be spending a little more time reading it, which I think would mean that you were comprehending more that was in that actual newspaper. So again, if that's a controversial opinion and you want to let me have it or agree with me, you can always shoot me a message on Canvas or email or whatever. I'd love to hear from you. All right. So what is it about? What is distinct to like the distinct style of article writing for newspapers? Well, if you recall in part 1, I talked about the fact that in broadcast or multimedia reporting, right, that we do cover the 5 W's and the H, which is the who, what, why, where, when, and how. Okay. We do the same thing in newspaper writing, but there's a difference. So when I'm teaching my MEA 125 class, I don't have a description of it here, but imagine like the letter T. And so when you're listening to any kind of story, the goal is to, in broadcast, right, is to kind of like hook you, to tease you to come in and listen to the story. And then later in the story, deliver all of the important details, all the 5 W's and the H. That's called the T formation. In the newspaper industry, in a newspaper article, it is called inverted pyramid. And so basically, it's only inverted pyramid if all the questions you have about the story are answered in the lead. So pick up a, or no, I should say pick up. Go ahead and click on a, a hard news story or some kind of story that on the LA Times website, New York Times, APnews.com, whatever, and take a look at it. And if you can answer those 5 questions and the 5 W's and the H, then that is written in inverted pyramid. If you can't, then it's not correct. So another way to look at that is that the lead in an inverted pyramid summarizes the most important facts of the story start. So theoretically, if that lead is written well enough, you should be able to read just the first paragraph and understand the story and put the story down, which I don't suggest, because then you miss kind of the details that get amplified and get delved further into. That's how inverted pyramid works. Now, why is that? Because if you look at this paragraph, you look at this diagram rather, really back in the 1860s when the inverted pyramid was created, and it was created, by the way, because during the Civil War, you had the North and South. They were constantly cutting telegraph wires, and so they were trying to disrupt instant communication. And so basically, what they did is, if you had a reporter, he was trying to he was trying to send his information over telegraph, right? Using obviously Morse code, not the reporter, but the Western Union guy, and boom, someone would cut the wire, and you wouldn't get the full story, before the wire was cut. So newspaper correspondents and reporters that were reporting on stuff from the front line got into the habit of just jamming everything into the front that was important to the story, and then just later adding detail, so that that's what inverted pyramid is. The other reason it's inverted pyramid is, back in when we were doing newspapers, right? And you needed to cut for space because you didn't sell enough advertising. If you just cut this chunk, this chunk, this chunk, you still understand what the story is. And so that's critical to know, is that as long as you've summarized the top, even if you cut some other things down below, you're still not compromising the main point of the story. All right. Okay. So speaking of the past, let's talk about journalism in early America. So this is where we get into the kind of the history portion of our part two here. And so early newspapers, and we're going to pick it up generally, guys, with what was happening over here in North America. There's, of course, newspapers go much further back and precede colonial times. But in all honesty, I want to focus on kind of the domestic front, if you will. All right. So in 1690, first of all, let me just say there were few papers in early America. Printers and postmasters did most of the early publishing. News was not as timely as it is today, clearly, because technology, we hadn't gotten into communication yet. So we talked about in that first part, the fact that news would travel by horseback, right, or by foot. Then it was by train or ship. I mean, it was very much a delayed process. It wasn't instant gratification. And the idea of a free press didn't exist yet, because we were still colonized. We were still colonies of England, which was a monarchy, which was the king, right? So we don't not a democracy until, we obviously go through the Revolutionary War. But that being said, the first newspaper to be published in the colonies was in 1690. Benjamin Harris published the first American newspaper, called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. One of the items in the paper alleged an affair between the King of France and his son's wife. It was not a good thing for Puritan officials to be reporting on a tawdry affair, and the paper was shut down after one issue. No free press. So, didn't matter what the subject was. If it offended the monarchy, or offended someone, a friend of the monarchy, or was too tittillating, it got cut, right? In 1704, Boston postmaster John Campbell put out the Boston Newsletter. The difference being than 1690, 14 years later, by the way, it was published with royal permission. So it was actually got the the blessing of the king, right? And basically all it did was republish many European news articles. Well, predictably, it only drew 300 subscribers. It was not profitable, and it soon went out of business. Next up was the New England Courant. I do not have a date for you. I meant to look that up. My apologies. James Franklin was the publisher. The last name Franklin should ring a bell. Yes, he is the brother of Ben Franklin. Anyway, James Franklin published without government permission his newspaper. Problematic, because he was eventually tossed into prison. Somehow, Brother Ben took over the paper, moved it from, I believe, Connecticut to Pennsylvania, where he started the Pennsylvania Gazette. Somehow managed to stay out of trouble. And while running the Pennsylvania Gazette, he created such things as legible type headlines, which of course we're all used to now, because a lot of times that's how we get our information. We just read the headline. A cleaner layout. Ben did, retired at age 42. but during his career started several papers, published a magazine, ran the first editorial cartoon, proved that advertising copy could actually sell merchandise. So everything that we see today, advertising wise, that shows up in news, you can really blame Ben for it, which is a good thing actually. And demonstrated journalism could be an honorable profession rather. So that is Ben Franklin. Well, as we move into closer to the Revolutionary War, if you will, basically there were two general types of newspapers during this time: political, which was obviously partisan. It almost feels like, in a way, this, we're so partisan now with a lot of the things that we see on cable and our news now. I almost feel like we're sort of like seeing history repeat itself in somewhat of a way, just a little bit. But anyway, these newspapers were constantly, either pushing loyalty to the king or the separatists, which eventually became the revolution, right? You also had commercial, which, served business leaders, and readership at this point was primarily confined to educated or wealthy men. So that's who was reading it. So you had to be wealthy, you had to be educated, and it was not for the common person at this point, because, as I'll explain later, it had a lot to do with not having a school system in place. But sorry, before I get there, let me just mention that of course the Revolutionary War happens during this era. 1776, we go to war with England. By 1791, we ratify the Constitution, so 15 years later. And of course, in ratifying the Constitution was the First Amendment, which you should know is the freedom of speech and press. Certainly one of the most important aspects of establishing our democracy was the freedom of speech and press. And, I could go on for an awful long time on how, particularly the freedom of speech has been tremendously under fire in the past several years. But anyway, that's what the First Amendment is. So newspapers grew as the new country grew. The first daily newspaper began in 1783, but by 1800, most large cities had one daily paper. And by 1824, you had 24 dailies, 66 semi or tri-weeklies, and 422 weeklies. Lots of numbers there, but just know that it became, newspapers started to grow just as we did. So just so you know, as we start talking about the penny press here, so in the early 1800s, the early 19th century, if you wanted to read a newspaper, it was expensive. First of all, you had to have, obviously, money. You had to be educated. And how much money did it cost to basically purchase a paper during this time? Well, early papers cost $10 per year, which, of course, now in 2022 terms seems like nothing. But back then, it translated to 6 cents an issue, which in today's terms would relate to being a pint of whiskey. So basically about $10 or $12. So think about a daily newspaper costing, every time you want to read a paper, you'd have to pull out $12 out of your wallet. That's a lot of money. But a couple things happen here. Technology and society basically combines to transform the newspaper industry. First of all, we get what's called penny papers, and that was made possible rather by technology. There was during the 1830s, the steam-powered printing press was invented, which made printing quicker and cheaper, 4,000 copies per hour, and certainly more copies of something, more of anything, more supply of anything makes the price go down on it, correct? And that is so it doesn't take a genius to figure out that penny papers were 1 penny. They'd eventually go to 2 cents, but at least early on, they were 1 cent. They were sold on the street. They were extremely popular, and they're about to become even more popular because of an education system, which, by the way, let me back up here. In the 1830s, so penny papers were created in 1833, okay, with the New York Sun. That was the first penny paper. Okay, then the New York Morning Herald made its appearance, and you can see what it kind of like focused on. But the interesting thing is we also had a school system established in this country in the 1830s. So literacy on a broad scale. So as people learned how to read, that's obviously when textbooks are created, because we'll talk about them when we get to books. Well, they were also learning how to read newspapers. And so, so cheap newspapers, a hunger for reading, basically boom was like the perfect storm. And you have, suddenly the newspaper industry becomes the, a very, very big thing. Okay. So we have the New York Sun, which favored human interest stories. Prior to this, again, remember, newspapers had focused on business and had focused on politics. In this case, this was human interest. The New York Morning Herald was an independent paper for middle and working class readers. So the first paper to really aim itself not at the elite, but the actual middle class and working class. All right, penny papers were innovative. Okay, they reported local news and crime. They separated news and editorial. So now, instead of a paper just propagandizing in everything, now you should have a separation of what I call church and state journalistically, which is news and editorial. Unfortunately, the separation of church and state has condensed itself in 2022. And you know what I mean by what I talked about in part one. Neutrality is good for advertisers. Advertisers generally don't want, at least in the newspaper and journalism industry, don't want to saddle themselves on any one philosophy, which has also been very interesting to watch because, we've seen a lot of corporations very recently start to take stands and how that has been detrimental to business. The most recent one in Florida with the so-called Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, which basically essentially says that you can't teach sexual orientation to, among other things in the bill, you can't teach sexual orientation to kindergartners through third grade. Well, the Walt Disney Company, of course, took a stand, and of course, then that became, they lost initially after that. Kind of stance, they lost like $30 billion in value on the stock market. So I don't know, it may have, rebounded by now, depending on when you're listening to this lecture. But anyway, so that's what I mean is that neutrality is good when you're talking about business in general. And that was the same thing for the newspaper and journalism industry. The Associated Press was actually founded during this time. There are two major wire services that are out there. One is called the Associated Press, or AP for short. The other one is called Reuters. The Associated Press was founded by 6 New York newspapers in 1848, and it became the first major news wire service, which means that they, and often, with the AP basically takes stories and then aggregates that out to all sorts of major newspapers that subscribe. Okay, we move on. All right, so before I get to our big publishers here and start to feature them, a couple things I think you should know about. The New York Times was born, came around in 1851. We have newspapers eventually doubling in price to 2 cents. And because they are so inexpensive and so popular, they really become sort of a target for folks that want to make a lot of money. And so that, and because of that, let me read you a stat here. Between the war, which is the Civil War, by the way, which was from 1861 and 1865, and the turn of the 19th century, which is basically when we get to 1900. So the latter part of the 1800s, the population doubled because of immigration. People moved from country to city. So we have the Industrial Revolution take hold. Newspapers during this time quadrupled, and profits went through the roof. And so you have a number of people that jump in to really kind of like take advantage of this fertile breeding ground for not just new customers, but for advertising and for revenue. And so the first one I want to feature is Joseph Pulitzer. You've heard of it. the Pulitzer Prize. That's named after Joseph Pulitzer. He emigrated from Hungary, the country, not that I'm hungry, right? Basically turned the St. Louis Dispatch into a success, also increased a paper in New York's circulation from 15,000 to 250,000. He stressed accuracy, tied circulation to advertising. So he went the Ben Franklin route there, which means basically, what does that mean? It means that the more papers you sell, the more you can charge companies to advertise in your publications. So it means profit. He aimed his paper at a large population of immigrants by the use of simple writing and illustration. So he, an immigrant himself, was aiming his paper at immigrants who didn't know the language very well. So he had to keep the language very simple in the newspaper and also combine that with pictures and illustrations so that people can understand the story. Very cool. E.W. Scripps is your next major publisher during this time. E.W. Scripps, which the Scripps Howard Company still exists. They own, not just TV stations all over the country, but they own a lot of different, newspapers and media outlets all over the place. I think, if I recall, Scripps owned the, one of the things that was one of the sad things for me was Scripps owned the Rocky Mountain News, and unfortunately, the Rocky Mountain News folded. I want to say in about 2009. It was a major rival to the Denver Post. But anyway, so that's the Scripps family. But anyway, he started papers in Cleveland and Cincinnati, both very industrial areas. He featured concisely edited news, human interest stories, editorial independence, and frequent crusades for the working class. So again, like Pulitzer, aiming it at a non-elitist audience and making a lot of money for it. He also, Scripps did, pioneered the idea of the newspaper chain. By 1911, he owned 18 papers, and of course, his company now is one of the bigger ones in the industry. Last but not least, I think we mentioned this guy when we talked about Citizen Kane in film. I definitely know that I have before. William Randolph Hearst. What a character. What an epic figure in journalism and just modern media history. So William Randolph Hearst, the difference between Pulitzer and Scripps, even though Hearst got into a battle with Joseph Pulitzer, Hearst came from the West Coast. So if you've ever driven north of San Luis Obispo, then you know the Hearst Castle. That was his lavish domicile. He was given control of the San Francisco Examiner at age 24. He went after readers by appealing to their emotions. Fires, murders, and stories about love and hate were given splashy coverage. He was heavy on sensationalism to increase readership. So he would have literally, I think, been absolutely fit right into 2022, because gosh knows that there's a lot of sensationalism within the modern journalism era. And I think William Randolph Hearst was one of the first to really sort of monetize it, if you will. He was all about impact and novelty and prominence. In fact, he moved east and bought the New York Journal in 1895 and locked into a major battle with Pulitzer. Okay, so he is synonymous, by the way, is Hearst, with what's called yellow journalism, which is the idea of overly dramatic stories. And yellow journalism really kind of finds itself during the Spanish-American War in 1898, where a lot of people say that Hearst got us involved into a war with Spain in Cuba to basically sell newspapers. There's a lot of evidence that that's true. So by all means, feel free to Google more about William Randolph Hearst. And of course, as you know, Orson Welles later used him as inspiration for his main character, Charles Foster Kane, where Hearst actually wound up trying to sue the movie company and Welles unsuccessfully. But that was our guy. That was Hearst. Anyway, New York World was which Joseph Pulitzer owned. as opposed to the New York Journal. Joseph Pulitzer encouraged plain writing and the inclusion of illustrations. And of course, Hearst was unscrupulous, the champion of the underdog, and the two often fought each other over, a massive circulation battle. All right. As for newspaper chains, we mentioned that with E.W. Scripps, the fact that by 1911 that he owned 18, that was not a uncommon thing. He kind of pioneered it, but many emulated it from that point on. The fact is that if you have a newspaper chain, the company can own several papers. It shares resources it can use. For example, if I'm a writer for a paper in Cleveland and I have a column, then I can share that column with an affiliate paper in New York or Cincinnati or Richmond, Virginia, or whatever, wherever a particular company owns a paper. And so that actually is a way of pooling resources. And that was something that was pretty typical business-wise for not just journalism, but a lot of other areas as well. And emergence of chains reflected the move toward oligopolies in the 1920s. Sorry, guys, I'm sure I butchered that word. It's interesting that the book says that they're in decline today. Well, yes, but no. I do think that because of the way journalism has worked, I think there's a lot of media companies that are now gobbling up other media companies. There is definitely consolidation and elimination of jobs. There is definitely selling off of papers. I guess in theory, I guess what this PowerPoint that was taken straight from the book meant that newspapers, the industry itself is in decline today, which I do agree with, because yes, circulation is down. There's less ad revenue. Now we're shifting to digital. And of course, we'll circle back to that in just a second here. As we move on though, during the Great Depression, total daily newspaper circulation increased by 2 million, but the total income of the newspaper industry dropped about 20%. Marginal newspapers had trouble hanging on. And again, if you want to compare it to other forms of mass communication, what the Great Depression did to it or did to those forms, obviously film benefited greatly because people were looking for escape. And, what better way than to go see a film for, a quarter or a double feature for a quarter. Radio certainly didn't have television to contend with yet. So radio was still very popular in the 1930s. So if you talk about advertising revenue or talk about companies that were already hurting and bleeding money or hemorrhaging money because of economic downturn, they were going to be putting their money primarily toward radio and film, or so I would say radio, and then less so toward newspapers. And then of course, I guess fortunately for newspapers that when television came along, we had gone past the Depression at that point. But certainly newspapers, kind of had the Depression as sort of the one, as a gut punch, and then had to sort of balance out with television post World War II. All right. In any event, we move on. By 1945, 60 chains controlled about 42% of the total daily newspaper circulation. By 1970, 157 chains controlled 60%. Again, consolidation was sort of the way to go because, newspapers were kind of in decline, somewhat. And when we get to the 1980s, okay, this is probably the next big step toward, towards something that I could say would be like earth-shattering within the newspaper history industry, right? And that is the invention of the USA Today, which was something that was completely different than had been seen before. Color, pictures, colorful graphics, diagrams. These are things you wouldn't see in newspapers. You saw pictures, but they were black and white. But that's what the USA Today brought. It used color and designed vending boxes to look like TVs. It mimicked broadcast news and the use of brief news items. Dare I say, if it could make it any simpler, it made the language and sentence structure of a story that much easier to kind of go through. And of course, the USA Today because you've seen it today. And that was something that came along around 1980. Of course, as we move into the internet era, online journalism has redefined news. It's replaced the morning paper It has sped up the news cycle. We can get it anytime we want. And of course, non-traditional sources shape stories. What I think that means is that basically we have, not just traditional media that are shaping stories, but sources from, say, hyperlocal, from blogs, from social media, from Twitter, from Facebook. I can't tell you, like, for example, in my news class, when they're looking for story ideas, how often students will actually find story ideas from people posting about it on a community bulletin board, on Facebook or Instagram or whatnot. So it's really, really reshaped the industry. Of course, we talked about blogs in terms of broadcast. Well, blogs are obviously a part of the newspaper business as well, because you have websites that devote themselves, like Politico.com, for example, to politics, or let's see here. What's another one that I like? Awfulannouncing.com. That's a blog for insiders in the broadcast industry to talk about with sports journalism. There is Deadspin.com. There's, there's, blogs galore all over the place. Anyway, they were initially dismissed as amateur journalism because someone wasn't on staff at a newspaper, or quite honestly on staff at a TV newsroom. They were creating this stuff out of their house, out of their apartment, and they were kind of sort of looked on as secondary citizens. But we know that there's a lot of blogs that have been created out there that are quite excellent, that are created by people that haven't gone the traditional route. They've gained credibility and readership in recent years. And I think, even now you have major journalism organizations like the LA Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, just to name 3 out of, hundreds, that actually have turned to blogging as part of attracting readership. And so blogging has become a viable main feature across the board, whereas it was kind of this sort of niche, a while back. Okay, how about readership? How has that evolved, right? Well, readership, obviously a decline began during the Great Depression with the rise of radio. So if you think about radio came along in 1923 and beyond, in terms of like it's like a mass presence. And of course, as you start to see news in radio, become more and more prominent, that of course takes a little bit of market share out of newspapers. Well, then you have television that takes an additional market share out of newspapers. And so that's where you really see, the 1960s and 70s, where broadcast news starts, right? That's where the Walter Cronkite era begins. And, we see some big moments in television news history, like the Kennedy assassination, men landing on the moon, et cetera, right? And so that was another tough era for newspapers. And of course, once we get into the internet, it drops again in the 2000s because everyone's shifting online, right? Well, here's something interesting. Other nations have experienced increases in readership. In fact, I felt this when I went to Europe for the first time in my life in 2017, and then once again in 2019. I was blown away at, first of all, how many newspapers were in Europe. They were everywhere. London had, in fact, I had a London paper I was going to show it to you, but I left it at home. London has a number of different newspapers. And of course, they have a big online presence too now, but they have a lot of newspapers. France had a ton of newspapers. Japan, the Far East, readership in Japan amongst like newspapers, as I call them, tremendous circulation. So I don't know what the theory behind that is. I can only speculate. Part of that is, I think, because there's been a greater penetration of internet/news internet here in the US. There's greater competition. I think tradition in any shape or form in Europe, there seems to be more tradition internationally than here in the United States. I think, we're constantly kind of, I think, struggling for tradition here, or at the very least, sometimes battling over it. And I think that lends itself to how we consume media too. I don't know. That's something that something to think about and ponder. Why is it that international media is in a more traditional format, and also modern format too, but we are we have turned away from newspapers so dramatically here versus other nations that haven't. Maybe it's cost. I don't know. Maybe it's just the fact that, there's some other nations just don't have the internet penetration that we do. I sit there and sometimes try to think about those kinds of things. All right. How about convergence, right? Newspapers struggling to move to digital. Well, I think there's been a couple things. First of all, one of the things that's good is that there's unlimited space on the internet. So like newspapers where they had to cut story size for advertising purposes have been able to recognize the advantage of the internet, which is to say you can go to an LATimes.com or WallStreetJournal.com, and you don't necessarily have to your word count doesn't exactly have to fit an advertising space. You can immediately update stories, whereas in the past, for example, let's say 1940, if you were picked up in LA Times, that would go to print at like 11 o'clock the night before. And so anything that happened between 11 o'clock and when you picked it up in the driveway in the morning or that day until there was an afternoon edition was frozen in time, right? You couldn't update the story. Now, of course, you can, because you can go to a newspaper website and they can update things instantaneously, just like you can within other forms of content, right? You can provide links to related material, very helpful in articles. You want to read more about anything, you can provide a hyperlink and you can click on a bill, for example, if you're talking about some kind of controversial Supreme Court decision or bill, or some kind of past story that's in the story itself. You can click on the hyperlink and get more information on it. You have multimedia capabilities. Even if you want to go write for, you're an article writer and that's what you fancy yourself, the fact is that chances are that the publisher is going to want you, or your editor is going to want you to record the interview via phone or Zoom or whatever, and share that and take photos while you're at the story and share that as a full-fledged multimedia experience. That's why when you saw Lauren Hanna's story on Ukraine in part one, if you watched part one, then you saw that whole story about Ukraine. There was not just a video story, but there were also pictures to go with the article. But unfortunately, in many cases, those advances have yet to pay off, in the sense that you still have trouble monetizing it. Yes, are a lot of people clicking on these things? Absolutely. But they're trying to do it for free. And so if you try to go to a newspaper website these days, it is very difficult now, because they're all now behind paywalls, which is this notion that you have to pay, a certain amount of money a month or over a 3-month span to get access. You have a username or your email address and a password. I spend a few bucks every month to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. Otherwise, if I want to look at the LA Times or New York Times or whatever, you get maybe 4 or 5 free articles a month, and then you can't get in after that. It's very frustrating. So, it's I wish someone would come up with the notion of maybe having access to 20 or 25 of the biggest newspapers in bulk, and then just paying almost like it's a monthly cable bill, right? But that's what a paywall is. That basically it's an account. It's basically to have access to a New York Times or Washington Post. You have to pay a certain amount of money, weekly, monthly, quarterly, to be able to log in and actually be able to use that website. All right, couple more things here before we land the plane on journalism and call it a day. Let's talk about alternative voices. Let's talk about citizen journalism. We talked a lot about that clearly in part one of this too, because they do relate, right? Citizen journalism, not just applicable to broadcast or the visual side of multimedia, but clearly also part of the written side of multimedia, the article side, right? There's community journalism. There's there's blogs. For example, there was a guy that used to write a blog, that lived across the highway here in Stevenson Ranch. That what do you call that? The Spectator? I can't remember what it was called. Anyway, but yeah, so he was always reporting on very, very local things here in Santa Clarita. You have activist amateurs who use the internet and blogs to disseminate news and information. So basically, if you're interested in any kind of subject and you want to, basically christen yourself a reporter, you can do that. I mean, it's led to some interesting issues like organizations not exactly trusting journalists who say they're journalists. And then, of course, the other problem that I didn't bring up is that during the Black Lives Matter movement, and you had, police battling protesters, you had a lot of people that were, showing up out there, essentially saying that they were citizen journalists, but having no idea what their rights were as a journalist or what the First Amendment was, and we're getting into some trouble. And so one of the things that I talk about in my MEA 225 class and 125 class is reporter rights, right? Knowing what you have access to, knowing that if you go to a murder scene, for example, or the police tape off an area because it's a crime scene, that you cannot go over that crime scene. If you do, you can get arrested. Or you can go to a protest, and if it's declared an unlawful assembly, you can, like the protesters, you can be swept up in that. Versus if, for example, you go and, there's been a bad earthquake here in the building, and you go up to walk in here to take pictures, even though the building's about to fall down, the sheriff's department or whoever the law enforcement agency that's there can tell you not to go in, but they can't stop you because you have a constitutional right, believe it or not. So interesting, huh? So all these things are part of the industry that you have to learn. And if you're a citizen journalist, which is good, it is also, as I use the term, dysfunctional, because a lot of people don't know what exactly is good or bad about what they can do. Anyway, many news organizations are trying to corral citizen journalists to make up for journalists lost to downsizing. So as we see newspapers and we see, like, for example, here's one from the Signal. The Signal has cut back an extraordinary amount of reporters because it just doesn't make as much money as it used to. So it appeals to citizens in the community to write in about community events that they publish in the newspaper. So, they've got one sports reporter who's kind of a sports/news reporter. So if you go on the Signal's website, sometimes you'll see coverage that's sent in by the actual teams themselves, or a parent who's at the swim meet and wants to just enlighten the public to what happened. Kind of an interesting time to be alive when it comes to story coverage. Last but not least, journalism is a vital yet dangerous profession. I would say dangerous from the aspect here in that, yes, you're going to be put into sketchy situations, most likely not fatal. We had a former student, by the way, who was arrested along with another reporter during the Breonna Taylor Louisville protests. He spent 48 hours in jail. That same reporter was also ushered to safety in front of the White House during the Black Lives Matter protests when Trump was in office during 2020, and that kind of got sketchy. But overseas, you can see that 1,189 reporters were killed in the line of duty from 1992 to mid-2016, and as recently as March, 5 journalists were killed in the first month of fighting in Ukraine. Others injured. There was a very high-profile story of these journalists that got basically attacked, and you had a reporter who lost an arm and a leg that's still alive, and will obviously, I'm sure, be writing a book about it sooner or later. I saw him tweet a photo recently to say that he was recovering and thinking about his lost comrades. So newsroom cutbacks are also threatening many reporters. Democracy dies in the darkness, right? Basically, the more that we cut back reporters, the more that we don't, that we don't report on people that do bad things or policies that make no sense, the more that we land ourselves in trouble. And then last but not least, as the digital culture continues to grow, what will become of newspapers? I ask you this question, ponder this question. Do you think an actual physical newspaper will exist 25, 20, 15, 10 years from now, or will we be fully virtual by that point? It's a really interesting thing to consider. So that is journalism. Hopefully you've gotten some interesting information out of either part 1 or part 2 The next time that you see something fresh and new will likely be when I talk about the wonderful world of publishing and books. Yeah, so by all means, pay attention to the world, demand credibility, demand accountability with journalism, whether it be in the newsprint side or the broadcast side or multimedia side. It's a critical part of who we are in our democracy. And with that, I'm going to say adios. So thanks for joining me, and we'll see you soon.